Kalimera and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid A-Level Greeks. The sun is not shining because it's winter. I'm wearing a toga and eating olives, and today we're going to be looking at the causes of the Peloponnesian War in 460. And as always, a disclaimer, these podcasts are by no means meant to be a replacement for studying the original translated texts. That is kind of the key thing you need to do for completing the A-level and really getting a good grip on what's going on. All these are a kind of overview guide to some of the kind of finer details or bigger pictures that sometimes can get lost in translation, or particularly when you're faced with kind of the dense weight of some of the translated text. So previously in Stupid Ancient History we've been looking at the early stages of what Thucydides calls the Pentacontatia, a period of 50 years peace. Although, it doesn't take a genius to work out this is not going to last. And we've looked at how almost from the start Athens and Sparta seem to be on this kind of collision course for conflict, despite the best efforts of people like Cimon and so on. So this idea of the Thucydides trap. And then throw on to that, we've seen how the creation of the Delian League in 477, seemingly regarded with suspicion and as a threat by Sparta, which makes sense, this massive alliance made by Athens, despite the best efforts to make it seem non-threatening. And then we looked at in 465, following this disastrous earthquake that hit the southern Peloponnese, we looked at the Helot rebellion and its obvious impact on Sparta. And obviously the more vulnerable and fragile Sparta feel, the less willing they are to work with people like the Athenians. And then into this Helot rebellion along comes the Lacedaemonian sympathiser himself, Cimon, with a force of 4,000 hoplites to try and help out. But unfortunately he is immediately rebuffed by the increasingly suspicious Spartans. They see it as an invasion force. They don't really trust the Athenians, not even Cimon it seems, partly because of this vulnerability. And then Cimon goes back, he's promptly ostracised, and then following this ostracism we see a more anti-Spartan stance emerging in Athens, certainly more anti-Spartan elements take the reins in Athens, and we see with that event the two sides are increasingly edging closer and closer to war. So if we're looking at this idea of causation, we obviously need to differentiate our causes. So what we've got here is the long-term causes are set and primed. We have these two rival leagues, these two rival powers, Athens and Sparta particularly at the head of these two significant power blocks. And although neither side is actively seeking war, arguably for the Spartans at this time, and even Athens, war is the last thing either of these states need. So even though they're not actively seeking war, all the right ingredients are in place. I mean, if we want to take this view of kind of history repeating, the origins of the First Peloponnesian War is not dissimilar to the origins of the First World War. You have the two massive power blocks, all primed and armed, and in a kind of de facto arms race, effectively, certainly an alliance race and a race to see who is the most powerful. There's certainly a degree of armament going on, and all it takes is one unexpected spark to set all of this off. If we take the example of the First World War, this is the assassination of the Archduke by a Bosnian separatist group, which, to be fair, people may have seen it coming, but they certainly didn't expect that that was going to be the thing that would start the First World War. So before we get to the trigger that kicks off the First Peloponnesian War, let's have a little few details to add into this idea of long-term causes. Again, this is more the overview rather than the specifics in the sources. So we've already mentioned this increasingly anti-Spartan sentiment that's running around Athens. This is not new, this is not something we haven't seen before. We can liken this to kind of Themistocles and his actions after the Persian Wars. But what we see is with Chiron gone, this really becomes the dominant position in Athens. The people who are dominating Athenian politics take a different view to Chiron. They think they are right to dominate the Greek world, and should that bring them into conflict with Sparta, then so be it. This is not something they're hoping to avoid. And we see this sentiment really illustrated by the fact that the Athenians leave and denounce the Hellenic League, which they and Sparta have both been in since roughly 481. So this is a big step. This is quite a big diplomatic snub. This arguably is the one remaining act of diplomacy that holds the two together, and now that's in the bin. I mean, alright, the League had pretty much served its purpose and was a bit obsolete. I mean, the Persian invasion has been and gone, and Xerxes has run off, and, you know, according to Aeschylus, the flower of Asian youth is dead. But it's a clear message across the Greek world that Athens and Sparta are going their separate ways. This is almost like a very, very public breakup. It wasn't really a surprise to a lot of people, but the fact it is quite public and it's now very official, you know, this sends a clear message across the Greek world that effectively you can't be friends with both now. Better start choosing your sides. So our next event that we're going to look at, again, follows in this pattern of increasing hostility. So following the dissolution of the Hellenic League, Athens soon went about bolstering its position a bit more, again laying out the lines. You can no longer be friends with both, you're friends with one or the other. So whilst they're bolstering their position, they also seem to be either intentionally or accidentally, but probably not, aggravating Sparta. And this we really see in these next two things. So Athens replaced their membership of the Hellenic League with a new alliance with Argos. Yeah, Sparta's long-term rival, and yeah, we've all been waiting for Argos to do something. For most of it, they've just been sat there doing their Argos thing. But this is what they do. They join in alliance with Athens. They are the notorious thorn in Sparta's side. Again, this is a clear shot across Sparta's bows. You know, shots are fired. Argos are now allies with Athens, and it's almost like the walls are closing in on Athens. If that's not enough, the Athenians then sign an alliance with Thessaly, who has been engaged in a kind of on-off conflict with Sparta since the 470s. Again, whilst this is not openly directly challenging Sparta, and it's certainly not anything that can give Sparta enough grief that they can formally declare war, it's aggravating them. It's pushing them closer and closer. Athens are following a foreign policy line that's very, very similar to, you know, the kid in the back of the car who's got his hand a centimetre away from your face, and the whole not touching you, not touching you, not touching you. It's not an open declaration of war, but it's irritating and aggravating, and it's just winding Sparta up. And rightly so, Sparta become far more suspicious and even fearful of this growing power of Athens. It's fair to say that within the period of, well, within half a century, they've gone from being a wannabe rising star in Greece, certainly no one who could challenge the power of Sparta in the Peloponnesian League, but now they are definitely in a position to do this. They have grown, they've been hitting the gym, they've been hitting the roids, they've hedged up, and now they are a threat to Sparta. So it's no wonder Sparta are becoming a bit suspicious, if not fearful. And again, at this point, we should point out, if we're thinking about how things are presented in the sources, this is definitely the angle that Thucydides takes throughout the entirety of his narrative. Thucydides is quite clear that he's pointing to Athenian expansionism as the main cause for conflict with Sparta. And while this isn't a these two alliances aren't a direct challenge to Sparta. They're a step in the right direction. They are certainly not calming any fears or calming anyone down. So whilst Athens is doing pretty much everything it can to not only expand its circle of influence, but intimidate and posture against Sparta, the actual trigger that causes the First Peloponnesian War is actually nothing to do with Athens. It's found within the Peloponnesian League. The spark that starts everything off is a border conflict between Corinth and Megara. This is referenced in Thucydides 1.103. So both Corinth and Megara are members of the Peloponnesian League, and they are both incredibly strategically valuable, particularly to Sparta, as they guard either end of the Isthmus of Corinth. The Isthmus of Corinth we've seen before, certainly during the Persian Wars. This is almost a Spartan obsession. This is their line in the sand, this narrow land bridge that they think they can fortify and basically repel all invaders. And this is the kind of key to their isolationism. This Spartan isolationism, they'll happily sit in the Peloponnese and defend it on this border. So losing one side of it would be incredibly problematic. Now, the strategic location, and particularly the nature of the isthmus though, this is really the root of the problem, because like I said, this is a border conflict. If you look at the Isthmus of Corinth, it is a notoriously narrow part of Greece. There's not a lot of land there. And the problem is that if you have two growing cities on either end of this isthmus, as their populations grow, as they become more affluent in the years following the Persian Wars, they're going to need more land. And ultimately, the borders of these two city-states are going to clash. And where they meet, where they rub up against each other and clash, this is where you're going to see arguments over land. This is the border dispute that seems to be emerging. I mean, it could literally be an argument over whose goats get to go on what field, because of the expansion of these two city-states and the need for more land for farming, food and so on. So yeah, this border conflict, we don't have any details really, but yeah, realistically it's likely to be an argument over farmland. I mean, it's got to suck if you are the guy who started this kick-off just because you wanted to put your goats on a field. So the border conflict is the start of the problems leading to the First Peloponnesian War. So hopefully you've sat back and asked yourself, hang on, how does an argument over goats lead to a war? Good point. So, given that both of these states are strategically important and member states of the Peloponnesian League, you could be forgiven for thinking Sparta might want to intervene. It might be in their interest, or the wider interests of the Peloponnesian League. But you'd be wrong, because let's face it, this is Sparta and they are not the world leaders they think they are. So as the conflict escalates, obviously as the larger and more powerful state, Corinth gains the upper hand. Not a huge surprise. And it almost looks like defeat was pretty much on the cards for Megara, with all the problems that this would entail. So at this point, not fancying being defeated by Corinth, and certainly not being overly pleased with the lack of inaction from the Peloponnesian League, Megara decide to jump ship, secede from the Peloponnesian League and leave because they see no actual benefit to being in it. They've asked for aid from against Corinth or some mediation. This has not happened. What's the point in being in the league? So they secede, they jump ship. And they jump right into the waiting open arms of Athens and the Delian League, who are not going to turn away someone like Megara. Because obviously this is a major coup for Athens. They now have a strong foothold on the Isthmus of Corinth. They're squeezing Sparta back further and further into the Peloponnese, and they know this is going to be quite a psychological blow for the Spartans. They are no longer masters of the Isthmus of Corinth. So whilst potentially this is a bit of a major coup for Athens, it certainly gives them bragging rights, the biggest impact of this defection now, though, is that rather than the conflict being an internal conflict between members of the Peloponnesian League, we now have a situation where a member of the Peloponnesian League, Corinth, is in a major armed conflict with now a member of the Delian League, Megara. And given the fact that the Delian League effectively at this point is a form of defensive pact, this, in theory or legally, brings in the entirety of the full weight of the Delian League and its military alliance to bear on Corinth. Even if this is not going to happen, then legally this is the situation. In turn, obviously realising the potential calamity that's heading their way, Corinth appealed to Sparta for aid, and effectively the two leagues now, as a result of this border conflict and the switching sides of Megara, the two leagues are now in a state of open conflict and open war. And it seems, we've got a tiny little barb to throw in that from Thucydides, that it seems that rather than seeking an alternative to outright war, rather than seeking some form of negotiation or arbitration, Thucydides, while he's sticking to his overall view that Athenian expansion is the cause of this conflict between Athens and Sparta, here he puts a fair degree of blame on Corinth. He flags up this historic and increasing hatred between Athens and Corinth as mainly the reason why diplomacy failed. That Corinth did not want to enter into discussions with Athens or with Megara. They've gone from a situation where they had the upper hand and now do not have the upper hand. But unfortunately, the way to avoid an open conflict would be to open negotiations with Athens. And let's face it, the Corinthians are not doing that, because according to Corinth at this time, Athens just suck. So in the Corinthian mind, they would rather head into a full-scale conflict than talk to Athens, because, Athens smells. So in summary then, when we're looking at the origins of the First Peloponnesian War, the easiest visual representation of this is like your cartoon bomb. We have our long-term causes. These are things that are in place for a long time. They are potentially dangerous, but until something comes along to set this off, it's relatively stable. So obviously our long-term causes, we're looking at what we've become to know as the Thucydides trap, this idea that the Athenian challenge to Spartan supremacy was always going to lead to war. We've had some rumbling issues already. Basically, as soon as the Persians leave, Athens and Sparta are pretty much at each other's throats, not physically, but kind of diplomatically, straight from 478 and Themistocles and his walls. We've seen the Helot rebellion add to these tensions, add to Sparta's vulnerability, but more importantly, get rid of Cimon. So we see this open hostility between the two, the rejection of Cimon, his ostracism, then leading to the rise of more anti-Spartan sentiment in Athens, and this then propels Athens to kind of pursue this policy of aggravating Sparta as much as they can, but without crossing the line, so Sparta have to declare war. If we think to the kind of the fuse and the thing that's going to set this bomb off, obviously we've thrown in this anti-Spartan rhetoric. We see this deliberate act to make alliances with those who Sparta do not like. They are siding with the people Sparta hate. And then the trigger that sparks all of this off, the tensions that have been building for quite some time, this Corinth-Megara border conflict, which ends up, and the intervention of Athens, where Sparta failed to intervene, ultimately ends up dragging these two leagues into conflict in 460 and the outbreak of what becomes the First Peloponnesian War. So there you have it, a relatively quick overview of the causes of the First Peloponnesian War in 460 BC. Thank you for listening. Hope this has been useful and not too tedious. Leave a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.